know, it might not be spelled the official way, but it is spelled correctly for that specific person correctly. And so, you know, it might not be spelled. What's that be? Oh no, wait, that was feedback. Okay, so then here we go with the institution part. So then I have always been interested in how objects actually exist within institutions. And this is one of the first projects I made working in collaboration with a museum. It was with this exhibition was at the Hammer Museum here in LA. And it was working with artifacts which were in the Fowler collection, which is an ethnographic museum that is cousins with the um, Hammer, which is the contemporary museum. And so in the Fowler, they had these artifacts that had lost their cataloging number, so they had no idea like what it was, where it came from. But there, you know, there are curators and conservators and staff who always are projecting and trying to find out what these objects are. And so the works have these like post-it notes with notes from like the 70s of different people trying to be like, I think this is like a stick from Africa, and then it's crossed out in the 80s where the new person is like, I don't think it's African, I think it's Asian or something. And so in a sense, it's like this editing of historical record as more and more information or technology or data is available. But then in a sense, what was interesting to me was this like real big impulse to try and access this historical past, which there's no way to actually access. And so the exhibition is consists of making these reconstructions based on the notes of these conservator notes. So, for example, this triptych is based on this, you know, these objects here in this little blue base are the objects from the Fowler, and they had a note that said these little trash bits belong to a ceramic, and so the, you know, it was just like a Ziploc bag full of like literally trash. And so, but the collections manager told me that there was a collector at one point that had a ceramic in his house and he just used it as a coin dish. You know how like you put tchotchkes in it, and then he donated that ceramic to the museum with the trash inside of it. And so when they accessioned it into the collection, the objects within them became part of the whole object. And then years later, the ceramic itself got lost. So all that remained was the Ziploc bag that said, these things belong to a ceramic. And so based on that note here, I made this like reconstruction ceramic, which literally makes the object belong to it. And then the drawing is the final version of the triptych, because it's like I think of it as sort of documentation of them being together, since I can't literally install those objects in the reconstruction. um, sorry. And then one of the things about this exhibition that I really loved was that through the process of moving the objects from the Fowler to the Hammer, the Fowler staff had to come up with a loan form. So they had to come up with insurance information and the object description. And so in a sense, it was the beginning of this like paperwork shuffle, institutional paperwork, where it's like, there's no way to actually know how much these objects are worth, but you have to, you know, the system itself is made to prompt all of this information. So I think that now they're all like $10 insurance value minus this like ivory tusk, which was $50. So some arbitrary thing, you know? And also the naming of the objects became part, like they came out of our conversation. So there was like a one grass thing that, you know, one of the curators was like, yeah, that looks just like something a friend gave to me when I was pregnant. So now it's officially called January. January is her name, so it's called January's fertility belt, until somebody else comes up with a better version, because it is looking like her fertility belt. You know, so in a sense, it was just like, how can these objects be representative of something in people's current life, until like as a placeholder, until like, you know, there's like alien technology that we can time travel and actually see what the original version is, no? And then here we come to Megan and I's project. And so, you know, the first time that I met Megan, I got invited to make this project for the PST. Is like this like Getty show, and my work was, I wanted to work with the West Mexico ceramic collection at LACMA, but I was really working in the contemporary building, and so somebody put me in touch with Megan, who was working there at the time. And then I was really interested in the you know, institutional procedure of like collecting, you know, private collecting, and then like LACMA as a public museum, how they sort of navigate those things, because with donors and like time and labeling, you know, institutions have to navigate a lot of very sensitive and contradicting, you know, perks. I don't know if it's perks or like functions. I don't know. So in a sense, the project was based on this room, which I think that if I'm not, there are artifacts from West Mexico that are were mostly found in graves. But what was interesting to me was that when I went in to see this room, you know, this man, Proctor Stafford, his name was like in every single label. And so then I thought, it's like, okay, if I'm looking in this room, like the thing that appears and repeats the most is this man's name. So it could be actually interesting to know, why is the private collector's name still shown in here? And, you know, it's like has to do with like 70s style, like accession policy or whatever. No, but in a sense, some of the conversations that Megan and I were talking about is how people who work in institutions now sort of inherit all of these policies and methods that from like the time when they actually came into the collection. And so I actually just really wanted to know whether that ever expired, you know, because I always try to think of the object in sort of first person, where if I was this ceramic, I was like, my function is to be buried with somebody forever. And now I'm on view with this man's name. Like, who is this guy? I don't even know. And so in a sense, it's like, it's, you know, and so I think about it like some sort of like branding or shirt that you don't like. And it's like, I don't like this label. And so in a sense, it's like, when are you going to get an outfit change? I don't know, you know, so does it ever expire? Especially because, you know, the thing about Proctor Stafford was also that he sold the objects to the museum instead of doing some sort of like donation, which is like most of the time, I think, when there's like this gesture of, you know, philanthropy where you donate your objects to the museum, then you get some sort of dibs or something, even though you get a tax write-off. Anyway, so the project was there were different phases. This thing was so big that, but one of them was I wanted to separate them by state. And so I made these drawings that were like Jalisco, Nayarit, and Colima, which was sort of separating the objects by like most known location, to see if they would have some sort of like repeating patterns or something. And I do think that there's some like, you know, Nayarit one, there's like the ladies who sit like this is the only one that has ladies that sit like this style. And I don't know if it's right, but you know, like these are like more obese. And so like, why are the, you know, like the more chunky ceramics here? And then these ones are the ladies ones. And then there was some like, I don't know, I think this one had the most. So I think it included a lot of the the other ones, but there's no ladies that sit like that. So it's mostly like how the cataloging of these things, because then I thought, you know, Colima, Nayarit, and Jalisco actually didn't exist in the time that these were made. So then I actually have thought, since the project, make an update to make it be, instead of Colima or Nayarit or Jalisco, that it would be like a coordinate, like a geographical coordinate, instead of the name of an actual state, which was not the case. You know what I mean? I'm like, oh wait, that wasn't there anymore. And so I also wanted to make this, you know, because in conversations with Megan, so this is a project that was like, really the objects come out of talking to Megan, and the issues with the provenance, or like, I just ask her questions and make works based on the responses. And she had mentioned that, you know, one of the known provenances of these ceramics were that they had been in private collections right before. And Proctor Stafford, in an interview, said that they had been adorning mantles all over the world. And so I just was like, okay, so let's make these sort of drawings of how they would be, you know, like in the immediate past life before it was on the grave, no? So here they are in different mantles, dogs. Wait. And then this is also to think of them in the near future. So one of the issues with these ceramics, like I said, is that it's very difficult to sort of track their provenance. So I wanted to make an object that would be the best future artifact. And so these ceramics are based on general shapes that are found in the collection, but they have this GPS tracker which will continue to track them. So in the future, they will be able to be well documented, I hope. Then some of the projects that I'm more recent one. This is last year. I made a installation for the Whitney Biennial, which was 3 different ways of not interpreting the text of this La Mojarra Stela 1, which is a monument that has this undeciphered writing text. This work is one, looking at the formal shapes in the text. So the box inside of it has these plexi sheets that are separating the text by size. So like all the squares or all the circles or all the faces in the stone. So in the best case scenario, you can pull one out and like align it and just like read it by all of the squares and whatever. No. This middle one is based on the idea of like Mesoamerican obsidian mirrors. So they use the obsidian mirrors as like divination tool to find out things about oneself that they didn't know. And so the object in front of it is La Mojarra with these holes, which is like little bits that are damaged and scraped off of the original one. So I thought that La Mojarra would be looking at itself, trying to figure out what the missing bits of it was. And then the third one is this work that is about the sort of difference between a very formal structural structure setting of the text. So the backdrop is the text, how it's incised into the stone, and then the object in front of it is the text, the characters, but they're suspended in this kind of like a lava lamp thing. So it rotates, and as it rotates, it makes these like different connections. And so when you see them next to each other, my hope was that they would align, and then you'd be able to be like automatic writing or something next to the actual writing. Oh, this one I wanted to show because Megan, you don't know about this one. So this one is what is it? Proposal for the reconstituting of ritual elements of the Sun Pyramid at Teotihuacan. So, we have a common friend, Matthew Robb, who is a curator, and he's like a Teotihuacan expert. And he made this exhibition at LACMA, which was recent finds of the Sun Pyramid at Teotihuacan. And 2 of the objects were these like giant stones that had been found at the top of this pyramid. And like Teotihuacan is like an amazing, crazy structure that it's like, if you just found these stones inside of the top, it was definitely not made for human eyes, like there's no door or whatever. And so in a sense, like the people who made it took a lot of energy to get these stones and stash them at the top of this ritual pyramid that is like the connection between humans and like this sun deity or whatever, no? And so like when I talked to Matthew, it was like, well, did he even think about what would happen if you take out this like integral part of the pyramid? Like, are we having COVID because of the misalignment of this like spiritual thing? We have no idea what happens, no? And so in a sense, I was thinking, if I was like whose is this pyramid? And it's my current interest is more like artifacts that are ritual objects or objects for the afterlife whose function is still ongoing. So in a sense, it's like, the afterlife is forever, and like spiritual relationship to something else doesn't actually stop. And so what happens when you like, through the process of archaeology or displaying them, you sort of break this connection. And so this project was to make these replicas of those stones, to put them back and fill the hole that they left inside of the pyramid. And so to do that, I was like, okay, Matthew, help me figure out how you would actually get these stones back in the pyramid. And he said that I had to like ask INA and propose to them, because Mexico owns the copyright to all of the antiquities of the country. So I had to ask for a permit to make the replica to begin with. And then this letter goes with the piece, which is literally like, I'll donate it for free if you just put it back in the hole, no? Yeah, those are now we're talking about really super recent and future projects. This one we were talking about really recent. It's I was invited to participate in this in plain sight initiative that was made by artist Rafa Esparza and Castles here in LA. that was 80, that it's a collective of 80 artists, and we were making this skywriting on top of sites where detention sites across the country where kids are detained. Not just kids, I think it's just everybody's detained. And so we were invited to come up with text that would be written on top of the detention center. So mine was written on top of Rio Grande Detention Center in Texas. And the phrase that I did was Mi cielo TQM, which is my dear, I love you. Or, I mean, there's so many subtle variations of that, because TQM is kind of like a Spanish version of like, I mean, it's literally te quiero mucho, which is I love you. But you know, TQM, like everybody knows what that means. It's kind of like WTF or like TTYL or something like that, no? And then mi cielo is like my darling or my dear, but it's also cielo is sky. So it just was this idea of like what type of a message somebody in the detention center would want to read. So the audience for this text is the people who are detained, instead of like a general public or like the people who are running the camp, the detention center. And it's also like a general message that, you know, it's a endearing sort of thing. I mean, I also just thought that, you know, it's such a difficult subject to really talk about, that that maybe some sort of soft connection would be nice to feel if you were there. And then if we have brief time, I'm going to talk about my two projects that I'm working now, which is, I guess I could just show you proposal drawings because it doesn't exist. And so the work that I was doing in Cambridge, I was doing a fellowship at Harvard for the past year, was with the collection of the Peabody Museum. And they have there these artifacts that were dredged from Chichen Itza. And so the project is, so Chichen Itza, the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza is like the rain god's ritual site. And so it was dredged in like the 1900s and by this consul, American consul, and through all of these legal loopholes, he was able to get them to the Peabody. And so I saw them there. And so the project is how to use similar litigation in legal ways to put them back. And so in a sense, it's just litigating on behalf of Chaac, the rain god, you know, with property rights and all of these things to get those objects which really belong to him back into his property. And so the installation will be the proposed installation, so we don't even know how close it will be, is to have the artifacts that were dredged, borrowed from the Peabody, and they would be installed under a water dripper. So Chaac would be in the water because he is everywhere and in every liquid, and then the water would drip on the objects and they would dissolve into they're for him, no? So then that's sort of the proposed installation, but we will see how practical it can be, no? And then, so that's sort of a, you know, it's I guess it's a way in which you can see how like the original proposal of a project might not be practical at all, and somehow it will, you know, come to a compromise with what could actually get made. So this actually will be shown at the Sao Paulo Biennial whenever it opens, who knows when. And so it's the general idea is to use litigation in the way to litigate for the afterlife and use these human sort of, you know, ethical shapes to bring it back to a spiritual reconstitution. And then like side note, there's also, you know, like I was thinking that I would litigate also on behalf of like Lucia, the oldest mummy in the Americas, who definitely is on view. This is part of this next project, which is, you know, thinking about body parts and collections. And so this is a work that will be installed in the Gwangju Biennial next year in Korea, and it's similar, where it's like they have this bodies, you know, a lot of museums have body parts in the collection. And so the installation is to find a way to contact this afterlife and this specific dead person and ask them where they would rather be, because they definitely do not want to be in a collection because they were in the ground, like living their best life, living their best afterlife. And so in a sense, we're gonna hire a shaman who will get in touch with this body and ask them where they would want to be. And the way that it's shown is through this paper marbling process. So paper marbling is the most uncontrollable sort of form of image making, because it's like literally ink suspended in water. So you can't actually control the way that the image will be. And so in the moment in which the ink is suspended, the shaman will contact the afterlife. The dead person will control the image. We will make a print, and then it will be where they would potentially want to be. That's the two works I'm working on now, Megan.
Wow, this is amazing. Thank you so much, Gala, for this incredible tour through your work. I come up with a list of questions before because I was like, what if we don't have anything to talk about, which is ludicrous, right? Like we always have things to talk about. And now I have a list of more, as your work brings up so many ideas. And I realized when you started talking that I didn't properly introduce you, or right? But I think you introduced yourself pretty well, right? It's better to give you the floor. I mean, you've worked in multiple countries. You've worked, communicating with many museums. And I have to say, when I was at LACMA and I received this sort of panicked email from the contemporary art curators, like, we don't know what to tell her. Can you talk to her? And, and then proceeded just these wonderful, like, so many emails, and then we would meet for a meeting and it would be like, oh my God, 3 hours have just passed. And I just want to say, like, working with you opened up my curatorial practice and my teaching as well in ways that I had never expected. And that has been really wonderful for me as a person and as a scholar and as a curator. So I just want to publicly thank you for that, right?
Oh, you're welcome. I mean, thank you.
Wait, what'd you say?
Thank you for putting up.
Right. There were times where I was like, oh my God, I'm overwhelmed by all of these questions. Or you showed your letter to Ina, right? And I received one of those letters as well. And then a series of annotations on that letter.
So that, yes. So yeah, because I didn't show that image, but it was actually, the main point of it was to just literally, and I also think that, one of the main audiences for most of my projects is the people who is working in the museum. So it's like literally a letter directed to you, where it's like, hey, Megan, does Proctor Stelper's name ever expire? Like, and I know that there's sort of, you're stuck because of, museum bureaucracy or ways of framing or whatever, but in a sense, it's just like the audience looking is not the point is to, I mean, best case scenario is that it results in something, but for me, the main purpose and function of the work is to, like, through this dialogue that we're having, like, the audience might be able to just see these issues with the institution, the way it functions, without having to resolve something, because how can we do that? You know what I mean? Yes, you could, I can't do it, but you definitely can do it somehow. I don't know how. That's not my job.
Right. And it's also important how, like, you and I kind of argued quite a bit because, and I see that there's a question on the chat that says, clarify reference to the person's name on the objects. Isn't that important in attracting donors? Which was, a conversation that we had. And, when you were making the indices that, and maybe can you pop one of those up on the screen, in which one of the things I remember you saying is that you organize them by size, because that is something that we know, actually, right? There's one. So it's information that we know as opposed to all the information that has been lost, right?
Just and literally so, that's the only thing, size.
Exactly. But the thing with the donor's name or the seller's name is, for me, that's also a fact that we know, right? And so I found it interesting that you wanted to remove that when it is, even though it may not be something you want to prioritize, it is information that we know, and it's also important information, right? That the history of the piece, and you made your the works on the mantelpiece to try to reconstruct their journeys before then. But what I was trying to argue to you is that that individual's name was actually really important to have that history of the object as well.
Right. I mean, I do think that it's also the way that it's presented in the gallery space, because, you know, these objects have like an ancient life before they were buried, and then it's life after it pops out in the ground, their current modern life, which it is all of these donors. But in a sense, I thought that the way that, you know, when the general public goes into these museums is not about this current life. It's about this like historical past and like, look what they did back in the day, blah, blah. And so in a sense, I was like, just be very clear about it, because I would definitely love a show on how these objects exist in post, you know, popping out of the ground life. Like, how much tax write-off did he get? That's also something, you know what I mean? Like, how do these objects actually function within current modern life, which is not only, yes, it's important to know the near history of who just had it, but it's not, you know, some of the, if it's going to be about that type of knowledge, then it's just not to, because right now it just feels like you're giving some sort of credit to him. But in a sense, it was like, why not include how much tax write-off he got? Like, why not include the fact that he, as a private person, is building his own legacy with these objects, and not just like being this philanthropic, like anonymous person, you know what I mean? And so in a sense, it's just, all of those things exist, you know, where it's like, you know, there are altruistic collectors that will do donate works to it. But I think that with Proctor Stafford, it was just like, I could tell that it was like this sort of like Indiana Jones style guy who was like, I am the one who found these objects, like I am so cool, because he literally said that in the interview that I heard, he was like, the way that I collected and presented these works is the first time that these objects had been seen as artworks and not as historical objects. So I'm like, is he an artist? Because he's doing like really conceptual moves where it's like, oh, this cup is not a cup anymore. Now it's a sculpture. And so in a sense, it was like, if that was that makes a set of really interesting questions about, you know, the collector's role in this like sort of building of these legacies of people, and so in a way that overshadows this historical past of what the objects are, because there's no information, you know what I mean, because we don't know what they're actually for. And so like the actual facts that we know will overshadow those things, and it is actually more interesting in a sense.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I will say that when I was a university professor before I became a curator, and now I'm both at Emory, which is really amazing to be able to do both and to indoctrinate my students to ask the kinds of questions that you're asking, let's say inspire them, not indoctrinate them, is actually in my survey of Art of Ancient Mesoamerica, which I'm teaching right now, and I think some of my students are here in the Zoom room, that I had a really difficult time teaching ancient West Mexico because there was so little information known about the the archaeology, right? And I remember, so Virginia Fields, I was teaching in LA, Virginia Fields, who's now passed away, was the curator then. And I'd be like, please make her say yes to give us a tour, because I don't really have anything to say, right? But then when I started thinking about these pieces in their historical context of the 20th century, now it's my favorite lecture to give for well, not my favorite, they're all my favorites, but like thinking about how these pieces had lives in the 50s on somebody's mantle, or in the background of a movie, a Hitchcock movie set, or then these claims of, yes, I'm an artist, I'm making them into a collection, I'm changing your perception of these, right? Proctor Stafford, as well as Earl Stendahl and other dealers and collectors, like they were, Vincent Price, like they were working so hard to change perceptions of them, which I think was, they felt that it was a noble endeavor, but it also, of course, it was commercial for them as well.
That's the thing that I'm thinking about, is like, of course, those are really interesting conversations to have, but the fact that these objects were buried with somebody, in a sense, it's like, it's similar to the idea with the two stones in the pyramid, where it's like, oh, since we don't actually know how the afterlife functions, how do we know that, the beliefs of somebody who's not here anymore, like we have just ripped their like key to the afterlife, or like removed their pillow and now they're like rolling in the grave without their like thing that they need. And so I think that it's the question that I'm having is, of course, that the institution today has the motivation, like specific motivations of today, where it's like, yes, how does these function? But it's also how to not have that be more important than whatever the person who was buried with this object believed for that object.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know?
and I think that's why, I haven't quite figured out how to do this in the museum, right? Because our collection at the Carlos Museum is, we have similar issues, right? Things went through the art market, they went through private collectors, they've been donated to the museum, and we present them as this window into the past, right? And how do we present them? Yes, we want to use them to educate about the past, because they're actually some of our only evidence we have about the past, right? These ceramic sculptures from Colima were amazing, right?
Yes.
So how do we present them as a window into the past, but also about the present as well, and thinking about institutions and reflecting on our role as an inheritors of these institutions that we didn't make, right? And how do we think about redoing that? I don't have that answer yet, which is why I love artist interventions.
Well, I mean, I do think that in a sense it's just differentiating between archaeological objects, like I said, like if it's like the dinner plate of somebody a long time ago, like whatever, no, but in a sense it's like, somebody who's dead, the afterlife is still ongoing. So in a sense it's like, oh, well, it's literally if somebody was here and you like take their stuff from their house, so uh, and that's sort of the issue with these West Mexico ceramics, not necessarily that they're archaeological or they're talking about the current collector or whatever. It's mostly that their original function is still supposed to be ongoing.
Yeah, yeah. And the issue, of course, is that has been interrupted, right? 1950s by we don't know who did it. Though now that we are in the Stendhal Gallery archives, which is
I know.
amazing to have Gala as the artist in residence at the Getty, because we can work together in, like, oh, here's some new amazing pictures or letters that we found in the archives, where we can even reconstruct more. I call what has happened to these objects, because of our conversations, object amnesia, right? And how do you reconstruct? Oh my God, your dog is present, yay. Gary. And, like, but then how do you reverse that completely, right? I
I
know
don't
you had ideas that you,
think at all. There's no way to reverse things. I think that the priority is not to forget the original one, or for example, just to even think about the point of view of the original owner. So for example, if you yourself are a dead person and then you go with your like favorite thing to the afterlife and then like they take it away, like what is some sort of compromise that you might feel? So for example, with chalk, I know that those objects will not be put back into the cenote, but in a way to, if I was him, like maybe I could just be around water or something, so what would be, I mean, it's all about law, really. Like, how do you compromise these two things? So one, so both the past life and the current life can exist together without canceling each other out.
yeah, I think that's a great point. And it also sort of matches what was happening for the tombs or for offerings. Like if you think about the blocks and blocks of greenstone that were put under the plaza at La Venta to create a watery environment, right?
Yeah.
It, to recreate that in a symbolic sense, like to make a watery place, like
Mhm.
it seems like you are trying to get back to those original ways of creating environments using things and using materials. So
Yeah, 'cause I was like, if I was chalk, I'd be like, oh, those humans are like so messed up, but 100 years is nothing for me. So like, at least put it back somehow,
yeah,
At least I can see that you're trying,
yeah, yeah,
and then have some leniency, whether there's some sort of judgment on the other side where it's like, oh, yeah, what?
yeah. So in a few minutes, we'll probably open it up to more questions from the audience, but I wanted to ask you about your your contribution to In Plain Sight, the skywriting project, which I watched your presentation yesterday for after the film at the Getty, and I have to say that your contribution was the most heartbreaking for me, right? That because you're thinking about communicating with these children in ways that their mother would or their father would. And what I felt was so interesting about it is also just like when you think about the audience, right? The intended audience, those who are incarcerated can't see it. And those in power who could change it won't see it, right?
Yeah.
Or refuse to see it. So like who then is your audience and where does that, do you hope that it leads somewhere?
I knew that people inside would not be like, neither person would be able to actually access the whole amount, the text. But in a sense, I thought that if the audience saw the project overall, you would be able to actually get more meaning and content from the fact that they cannot see it, you know, because you see the message and it's like, it's intended for this person. And the fact that they cannot see it is an additional place to add more content to that specific text, because we really did have very few characters to do it. And I was like, okay, how can I make the writing itself, or like the relationship between the text and the people underneath, like the inaccessibility to it, be part of that content, you know?
Yeah.
I know, but I was like, oh.
No, but I think that becomes a part of the piece, of course, that those who need to see it the most can't. And that's what makes it even more gutting, right? Even the emotional impact comes through even more of that they're babies who are jailed, right? Through no fault of their own. And so I think it's a really good educational opportunity for people who may not be aware of, who may not be thinking about that children are still being incarcerated because they've crossed the border with their parents seeking asylum. And
I mean, I don't even know how to feel about that. You know, I mean, it's so difficult to think about. Oh, like I was talking yesterday, it seemed like, you know, the skywriting gesture is such a large form. You know, this was like 80 sites and very coordinated. I think it was like so expensive. And in a sense, it's ephemeral. So literally the text is up for like 3 seconds or 5 seconds until it disperses. So I think that in a sense it matches the scale absurdity of having these people be incarcerated as well. Like I was saying yesterday, you know, the amount of resources and energy that it took to make the project matches the size of the wall that the kids are in, no?
Yeah, it was also I mean, I know you've said before that, you know, the job of artists is to, or you're thinking about jobs and of the artists to, you know, make illusions, to make people believe in something, and how do you apply, you know, that to the everyday? And what I find so interesting is the way that I see your work is you're not necessarily creating illusions, but you're helping people see through the illusions of institutions that, you know, whether it be a museum or whether it be our broken immigration system. I mean, is that a fair characterization of what you see as maybe one of the through lines of your work?
I mean, you're probably right, but I think that in order to make the work from the studio production side, I always sort of see them at like projects as like sort of stages, you know what I mean? Like, what is the backdrop, which is the context, like who are the people, the audience, and then my implication is who I am, all the time today, the government, whatever the thing is, and then we making a play. You know what I mean? There is like actions that happen within that. There's actual physical forms within that. But I do think that maybe, yes, you're right. But I think that from the maker side is different from the audience side. I try to think as an audience as much as possible, but to generate the project is literally like, let's make a like theater style. Mm-hmm. Which might function in real life, like documentary theater. That's what I was talking about, where it's like, it's not real, but it looks very real. No.
Right. Yeah. So I feel like I still have questions for you, but there are questions
Okay.
in the Q&A. Elizabeth, do you want to read or should I?
You go ahead.
Okay.
So we did please clarify reference to the person's name on many objects. Isn't it important in attracting donors? Yes, it's very important to attract donors, but I think that that's not the main function of the exhibition space. Like we can have the names, and of course it's important to keep those documents, but there's so much paperwork that exists outside of the front stage of the museum. And especially because it's a public institution, so it's like why general public and donor public should be treated all the same, I think. Bella, what do you consider to be the most respectful approach for display of objects museums that have ongoing ritual function? So one of the examples that I always give, I mean, there are two which I've come up with. At the Fowler, they do have ritual Tongva objects, and so they are on display at certain times. And then on the weekend or on a scheduled time, the members of the Tongva community can actually go and use them as a cemetery. So they do the ritual sites. And so one of the things that's also interesting to me is how the objects within an institution also changes the function of the building itself. So when they're actually using those objects in the ritual form, the museum stops being a museum and it becomes a cemetery, literally, And so for that specific moment, that building stops housing artifacts and is like a cemetery in building shape. And so it's also being flexible as an institution with the function of the objects. I think the other one that I'm not actually sure where I heard it, but I know that I've heard it somewhere, is that in the Museum of the Native American in DC, they have a object that is meant to be fed. And so there's somebody there whose work is to feed it corn once in a while. So in a sense, it's just so contradictory to like conservation methodology that it's like, I can just imagine somebody there who's like, there's acid in this corn and I'm actually feeding it. So in that way, it's this really strange compromise where you can actually see that, the way of thinking of the people today is actually they're ceding it to this thing that is like the original function. So I don't know, it's just like suspending it where you're like, I know that I'm supposed to maintain the physical integrity of this work and I'm literally putting acid on it because I can respect the fact that it needs to be fed.
Yeah, and if I can jump in there, so that is both at the National Museum of the American Indian in DC and also in the Autry, where they feed corn pollen to pieces. So I don't know if there's acid, so it may not. I probably told you,
Yes.
but but that's okay. But that's the thing, and those were some interventions. Of course, the great Rick West, who was the founding director at the National Museum of the American Indian and then moved to the Autry, and who's retiring this year, his second retirement, in pushing museums to open up more to Indigenous voices, to descendant communities, to not always show things the way that museums always have, right? Or treat them. There's been this practice that's been set up over the last century or more than a century. And why are those the only ways to treat pieces? And especially who's making the decisions for them, right? People who may have no connection whatsoever to them, except maybe an academic connection, or people who have a cultural or ancestral connection to them. And I think that those moves in museums are incredibly important as we question what we do with pieces that have been taken from their original context. So, having people drum them and snuff them. And, I have people who say, why do you have our pieces in boxes, right? They feel trapped. You're not the only person who personifies these pieces. Lots of them do. Sorry, something weird just happened with my computer. But yeah, and I think that listening to people about more ways of how we treat these pieces is really incredibly important. So thanks for that.
I think that it opens a whole nother set of like repatriation questions. That is also, the thing that I thought about was like if my mother's things were on display, like repatriating them to me, the next living person or whatever, would still not be a return to the individual person. So I think that it's also thinking through like not blanket statement overall, but some things cannot actually be returned to its original owner or whoever has a say over how they're displayed altogether, you know? Because I was thinking, okay, like all of the things that I will die with my, once I die with my estate or whatever, you know, like even my kids who would be like the next kin or whatever would not be able to really have a say on how I actually want those things to be, you know? But I do, with this last question, yes, I seem to work with the institution. Yes, I love the museum. And so I also thought that it's like, if I was going to have the dibs to be able to complain about the methodological issues that are coming up, I would have to try and approach the conversations of these questions. And so I actually do think that a better approach is to, when I thought about these questions, like I think that even when we worked with the LACMA work and many like the Fowler show, you know, first impulse is to be like, are you saying that we're doing something wrong? Like pulling out all of the negative things that the institution is. But I really do think that it's overall institutional problems, and to be able to work through them would end up being a better museum overall. You know what I mean? So it's not necessarily like saying like, oh, you're doing this thing wrong, because we all understand that these are all inherited methods from like the 70s or whatever. And the museum is like a dinosaur. So in a sense, it's like the way that it will update all of its policies will be so slow that you can't, people who work in it cannot make it any faster. But I do think that maybe the things that are happening now with these questions of institutional practices and reassessing of collections will definitely make, you know, like put a fire on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thank you. That was Lisa Lee's question, our contemporary art professor in the art history department. And I definitely felt, I mean, when you first started approaching me, I did feel like, oh my gosh, are we being attacked? And then, but then it really began to feel like a collaboration and a rethinking, which was something that I have wanted to do also, right? And that's what I said, that it really has influenced my curatorial practice and my teaching and moving forward, which is great. Though I have a question of, you know, I think there are multiple museums who are turning to artists to say like, hey, how might you display? Come dig around in our collections and put them up and help us ask questions. And I mean, I think one question I have is like, is that the artist's job, right? Is it the artist's responsibility to change museums? What do you think?
I think it takes a specific practice. You know, I know that it is not, you know, at least for me, because my work is so much about institutional methods or whatever, it's really interesting. I mean, I always will agree to a project like that when it serves like a bigger question. So for example, if I can share actually part of the show that I skipped, the presentation was this, you know, I was invited to curate a show at the MoCA in LA, and I was like, I'm not a curator at all, you know what I mean, like from the objects from the collection. And so when I actually talked to the curator who invited me, I was actually like, I can actually get something for my own sort of practice from it, you know, like I'm not going to be a curator, but then it's also me as an artist did not want to participate in this show, because the original proposal that I did for the show was objects that are crappily made. You know what I mean? So it's like, once objects are in a collection and they're like made poorly, and it's literally a conservation show. Like, how are objects going to be conserved? And also the main thing is that artist is still alive. So for example, paper piñata from the 60s does not, no, toilet paper piñata from the 60s does not look like it did in the 60s, but the artist is still alive. So can I contact the artist and say, hey, we have acid-free toilet paper now. Can we remake it so it's now actually physically solid, and you know, the idea won't be sacrificed. The museum will get a really nice like acid-free sculpture. But of course the museum is like, no way, you cannot touch it because it has to be this acid full toilet paper from the 60s. So in a sense, it's just the methods that it's like, it doesn't matter to the artist that is that specific TP, you know? And so in a sense, I use the show to work through these questions of artist agency, like how much say does people, do we as artists have over our own work while we're alive? And so it's all, contingent works of like how Felix Gonzalez Torres was like such an amazing person to learn from, because so many of the things like the audience doesn't see in museums is all of these like forms in the background. So he has said all of these contracts that are like literally, hey curator, the things about this light sculpture is that it needs to have bulbs and it needs to be on, and literally you can decide whatever shape it is, and so the light bulb is really usually known to be like this vertical dangle thing, but MoCA actually owned two of them. And so this one on the floor is actually the same exact piece, because I decided, like me in my curatorial role decided the physical representation of this idea. And so in a sense, it was like, okay, I don't necessarily want to curate or work with an institution, but when it comes to like these opportunities when I could actually learn something or like show, I thought that this exhibition was literally for art students, because there's stuff I didn't know about how to work with institutions when I was in school. And it's like, hey, this is how you really do it. And I was like, I actually have been a working artist for like 10 years plus, and I still don't know how like parts of the museum work, contemporary museum even. And so when I do get invited to do these interventions with the collections and stuff like that, it really has to be like, I'm not going to make another show probably about relationship with the collector, because I already did that one with you. So the next one will probably be like deaccessioning works from the museum show.
Right, which you tried to do with us, but we couldn't make that happen.
I'm trying. I'm still. See, this is what I'm talking about. Where it's like I did propose it to you, and it was not physically possible, but eventually somebody will agree.
Yeah, yeah. So we just have a couple of minutes left, and I don't see a question in the Q&A, so I'll ask one that I've just been curious about. So I remember, well, one, I mean, it's obvious to everyone now that you're really interested in museums and really interested in objects in museums. And I remember you telling me once that you visited museums as a child, and when you visited LACMA when you were younger. And I just want, can you talk a little bit about like how that going to museums as a child, because that's one of our major audiences, though they can't come in now because of the pandemic, like how did that shape you as a thinker or an artist, seeing things in museums?
I totally went to museums all the time with my dad, but I think that it's just like when you're a kid and you go into this building, the building itself gives so much value to the objects inside of it that you feel like it's like, oh, it's our human patrimony or some like air of grandiosity. But the other thing that I was doing at the time was that I moved around a lot when I was little, and so my dad would make me make my own museum, and so it's like all these little bits of trash, like this is the calling card that I used to call my mom, and this we fought in the specific, and then the date and like cataloging number and all the forms. And so in a sense that really brought it to be like, actually those things in the like big museum with capital M1 belong to me too. It's like I am also part of like humanity or whatever the building is supposed to hold. And so in a sense, not to feel so removed with being able to think that you might be able to influence the way that is displayed, no? So it sort of removed that sort of grand feeling, whereas you're like the Olympics or whatever, and it just made it a lot more approachable.
Yeah.
And I think it's also approaching curators, as an artist, a young artist, is very difficult to like approach institutions and be like, hey, can I even talk to you, period, And so in a sense, it's just thinking that you are also a person who is working through the same type of questions, because
Yeah.
of course curators are very unapproachable if you think of them as their job and not that as like a person.
Right. And I think also you have a generation of curators who want to ask these questions, as opposed to, I think in the past, it's like, oh, wait, don't ask those questions because it might, disrupt the system or open the floodgates. How can we make these a part of our work and our practice, both as curators and educators?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I thought the same thing because it's like I would love to second life job is to be like a conservator and work with that. So I really do think that the museum is the people who work inside of it. And so it's not that, you know, the general sentiment would be to just be like, there's no way we're going to think about these like 80s, 70s, 60s style methods anymore.
Yeah. Well, when the pandemic is over, we want to bring you to Atlanta and come to Emory. And we have a wonderful conservation lab in the museum, and it would be great to have you in there and talk to our conservators as well, because they're also interested in these issues of what kind of treatment, how do you change over time in the way that you're addressing pieces as well. So I hope you'll say yes to that invitation when it comes.
Yeah, I've never been there. I want to go. I want to go anywhere right now.
Seriously. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to Elizabeth Horner for organizing and setting up the webinar. And thank you so much to Gala and Gary for sharing your morning with us. We really appreciate it.
Yes. Well,
Okay.
I guess I want to talk to you later more.
Okay. We will definitely talk later for sure.
Okay.
Okay. And I can't wait to see your upcoming exhibitions when those are allowed to happen as well.
I know. I'll send you
Okay.
pictures.
All right. And thanks so much to all of our participants for joining. Check out the Carlos Museum events page. We have some wonderful events coming up, particularly for Indigenous Peoples Day, and then later for Native American Heritage Month as well. Thanks again, Gala. Bye.